reading your reading your books, and being introduced to a conversation called art and faith. I mean, like, where do you begin? So we'll try to cut this within the time frame, but let's have a conversation tonight. Thank you everyone, Pacific friends and friends of Pacific. Thank you for joining us. We're here with Paul Eli and Majda Gama. A wide-ranging conversation about art and faith, as I mentioned, which in any conversation of such wide-ranging topics, you got to ask who's not at the table. So we've got a pretty good tight group here. Please submit your questions for a Q&A afterwards, your comments, anything that you're reacting to with these two gifted writers, and we'll have a session after we're done with our questions to have that conversation. So, without further ado, um, let's get into it. Um, I'll just introduce our writers tonight. Paul Eli is a senior fellow at Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. He's the author of two books, The Life You Saved May Be Your Own, An American Pilgrimage, and Reinventing Bach, Music, Technology, and the Search for Transcendence, both of them National Book Critics Circle Award finalists. His third book, The Last Supper, Art, Faith, Sex, and Controversy in the 1980s, is out now with FSG. I think it was released in May, so brand new. Thank you, Paul, for being here. Majda Gama is a Beirut-born Arab American poet based in the Washington, D.C. area. She's the author of In the House of Modern Upbringing for Girls, the winner of the Wandering Angus Press Award for Poetry, and The Call of Paradise, selected by Diane Seuss as the winner of the 2022 To Sylvia's Chapbook Prize. Her poetry has appeared in journals such as Agni, The Adroit Journal, Michigan Quarterly Review, Plowshares, and many, many others. Majda, so great for you to be here. I was thinking we begin with some excerpts. Majda and Paul, maybe we can read about 3 to 5 minutes each from your books. And Majda, why don't we begin with you?
Oh, thank you for having me. I know that there was a lot of work behind the scenes to make this happen, so I really appreciate the time that you put into it, Michael, doing the research as well. So yeah, let me read some poems from In the House of Modern Upbringing for Girls. This is the cover. So, all right. When did poetry become my rock and roll? You can't pass out to Diane Seuss on the turntable while a burning cigarette flirts with your knuckles, nor smoke roll-ups with papers ripped from Sandra Simon's Bikini Warsaw. Although if I could smoke the title Ransom Note attached to Wolf's Ear, I would. Forgo friends' DJ nights for open mic. Oh, I hate myself for blinking under the Klieg light when I could be dancing to white punks on dope. Now I mainline Miłosz, twitch for his Warsaw. What are you doing here, poet? I'm here for the destruction of the 20th century. And lately, I've been extravagant with ampersands because "and" is visually wasted on the page. I should be wasted in listening to Black Flag. Once among the smokestacks of 70s Manchester, there was a band called Warsaw, and they infected me young with their infinite black. I'm safety pinned together now by Emily Dickinson's dashes, by the fishnet stockings of her alliteration. Oi, 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 the soul selects her own society. And here's a poem about the Ramones. I was really taken with misreading the expression "the end of the century" in French, fin de siècle. Uh, in my brain, I just hear a Ramones song. Um, so this is the poem that came from that. Three chords, amped on cheap speed, reverberate across the nation like a rocket, setting fire to disco and the hormones of ugly girls. In the Midwest, the youth escape from cages, prepare to mark Manhattan with piss and spit and band names across the grimy marquees of the Lower East Side. No one knows Far Rockaway will alter a generation, or that the boroughs will bounce with b-boys and boom boxes. Mixtapes the only currency that matters to the decade Elvis dies in. The no wave, the new wave, the DJ, the heartbreakers, the dolls, the dead boys. You can't understand music until you annihilate what came before one garage in Queens. The Ramones sing, "Do you remember rock and roll radio?" It's the end of the 70s. I'll read one more poem. To Black Leather Jackets. Panels of jet cowhide, machine stitched, bought in a punk store, autumn of '93. I broke it in, my second skin. Prudence, my pet rat, chewed through the lining to sleep near the beat of my heart. A pocket over my breast held a moonstone, script from a Qur'an. Rat-like, I found the silken corners of the night and marked my boundary. On the dance floor, in the plume of a smoke machine, I'd stalk a black and white stage like Joan Jett in the video for I Love Rock and Roll. I wore her zippers, her pins, our one shadow of leather. Thank you.
Thank you, Majda. Um, it'll be a crime if we don't talk about punk rock at the end of this. Um, Paul, could you read something of your book for the next few minutes?
Yes, and I'll read something that I hope will follow on those poems pretty directly. Um, I grew up, as I mentioned, in upstate New York. SUNY Albany was populated by students, many of them from Long Island, who had grown up listening to a very progressive radio station on Long Island, WLIR, which was the first station, probably in the United States, to play the Ramones, one of them, and also U2. So I saw the Ramones 4 or 5 times, and one time was in the Scala, or the campus bar at SUNY Albany. It was around the time of end of the century. So for you to for me to find that song in one of your poems is very powerful. But what I'm going to read now will follow on that. Partway through, the singer went to one side of the stage and came back holding a long pole with a white flag on it. As the rest of the band played a clanging rat-a-tat-tat riff over and over, 1 minute, 2, the singer entered into a drama with the white flag. He stabbed the pole into the stage territorially. He brought it to the lip of the stage and drooped it over the crowd, the flag flapping in space. He climbed the lighting rig, holding the pole like a lance, and stuck the flag to the top. He clung there a moment, hardly older than the people below, but a rock star, Bono Vox, up close and vulnerable. It was a spring weekend show at the State University in Albany. It was U2. U2 played New York City a few nights later, and an image of a white flag became a logo for the tour they were on, silk-screened on t-shirts and programs. Bono made the encounter with the flag a nightly act of daring. At the US Festival in California, he climbed to the top of the proscenium arch and knelt beneath the flag while camera operators shot him in silhouette. At Red Rocks in Colorado, with torches blazing and tape rolling for a live album and video, he did it again. The silhouette of man, pole, and flag against the blood-red sky was featured on an LP sleeve. The scene played ceaselessly on MTV, the defining first image of U2 for many people. What did the white flag mean? Bono described it as a flag of color, distinct from the green of Catholic Dublin and the orange of Protestant Ulster. It had other meanings. Traditionally, the white flag was a flag of peace. It was a flag of surrender. 40 years later, the white flag, whatever else it is a sign of crypto-religious devotion. The spirit that powered U2's work in the early 80s, that called forth the unease and condescension that many people have felt for them from the beginning. Devotion is the religious impulse in its purest form. It's a strong feeling for something outside of oneself. It longs for the loss of self, yearns for surrender to some other. Often it stems from religious belief. Just as often, it's a character trait that is prior to belief, so that the devotee is drawn to religion as a space where devotion is encouraged and put to lofty purposes. Religious devotion, unlike hysteria, say, or fanaticism, is personal and possessive, such that when devotees mass together, the spirit is qualified as collective devotion. Devotion finds expression in rituals, called devotions. As the story goes, early rock music was a blend of country and western, rooted in the hymns sung in white churches, and rhythm and blues, rooted in the spirituals sung in black churches. And it gained its power from the repurposing of religious devotion for soulful self-expression. That story scants the thefts of black sounds by white performers, and it presents the taking over of sacred styles as an act of liberation. In fact, the sacred was subsumed, not left behind, and rock music ever since has been rooted in rites of devotion. That was true of punk. The press typed punk as nihilistic rebellion, but for many of the people involved, it was the basis of pure devotion. The Sex Pistols and the Clash, the Ramones, the Jam and the Buzzcocks, Joy Division and the Bad Brains, these bands that looked and sounded unlike one another had a devoted following in common. The bands and their fans were outsiders together. You felt a devotion to them that you couldn't feel for Fleetwood Mac or Van Halen. Felt a devotion to their thrift-shop clothes and hard-to-get guitars that you couldn't feel for the stuff at the mall. U2 weren't punks. For some, and that was the problem. They were devotees. They recognized punk's uplift in the Clash and the Ramones, and they channeled the devotion that they felt for punk into their first songs, which also draw on sources of devotion from outside the music world. Self-surrender is front and center. God, liturgy, verses, and signs are all there. So are good and bad, right and wrong, duty and calling. U2 are wide open to the spirit. They're devoted to the cause. At the same time, just out of their teens, they're trying to figure out what the spirit is and what the cause might be.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
We will definitely touch on the crypto-religious and devotion and ritual. But I wanted to kind of talk about the context of your latest publications. Majda, thank you for reading the poems from your latest book. Could you discuss briefly the development of this collection and how this proceeded from your previous works?
So this book took a long time to be published. Even though it's my second book, it's the first book that I ever assembled of poems, and I started to assemble it around 2011. So my first book, which is not technically my first, is a chapbook that Diane Seuss selected for the Two Sylvias Chapbook Prize, and that came together so quickly, and then was published so quickly that I was actually really infuriated that my full length took about 15 years to get out. But it's so specific, and it's the two books are quite different. The chapbook is kind of elegy, really. I lost my father, and when I was writing in the House of Modern Upbringing for Girls, and I'd really settled on the title and never veered away from that for very specific reasons. But the chapbook had more of a feeling of like a mixtape. Um, so it was play. It was more like text, moved into text, and had more of an instinctive ordering. This book underwent so many, so many variations, even though I didn't tweak the poems that much because I was really trying to avoid feeding tropes
Mm.
of Islam and East versus West, and so it was finally a friend of mine who's a fiction writer sort of helped me develop this arc, and I can talk about about what that is a bit later. I will say one thing that I wasn't conscious of when I was ordering the book, but I now realize is happening, and in the House of Modern Upbringing for Girls, is that it's sort of like a long qasida, which is an ancient Arabian poem that's an ode. And it typically has three elements to it. Um, the desert, you praise a camel or a horse, and then you boast about your tribe. And all of those elements are in the book. But what is really the essence of the Qasida is mono-rhyme. And even though the book doesn't rhyme and has some ghazals sprinkled through, uh, the girl is the mono-rhyme that moves through each section. And so it took really like 15 years of just being a magpie with the work. And I don't know if I'll ever be satisfied, but it's a year old this month, and I'm really, really glad to be here with you all reading from it and talking about it. So thank you.
Well, we're grateful for the care that you took with your poems and how it all came together. You mentioned, sussing out East and West. Could you talk about that dialectic and how that changed over time? A lot of your poems reflect back in time to, your childhood or your narrator's childhood. How did that dialectic change, to where we are today?
Yeah, the book was really affected by changes in history that were occurring. It wasn't just losing my father and needing to reckon with family history. Just for some context, I'm a dual citizen of Saudi Arabia and the United States. I was born in Lebanon, and that doesn't confer Lebanese citizenship. My father was a Saudi citizen, and my mother is uh, blonde, blue-eyed, Germanic Mary Margaret, who was raised Catholic. So she converted when she married my father, but never sought to instill in me any kind of Catholicism at all, actually. There's some trauma there, maybe. But so this book, I would say, goes from, I think, really trying to stop time and understand history. The Arab Spring had started. I was concerned about losing my father and losing access to the kingdom because there were still very strict guardianship laws in place. And then and then the ban on driving was lifted, and then all of a sudden I felt that some of the poems of my youth where I had a clash with the religious police, and I really removed a lot of poems that were more profane or even more critical. Like I started the process of self-censoring a little bit because I was aware that this book was going to need to find a sweet spot uh, to land between East and West. And I think looking back, I was really stupid because I allowed myself to be interviewed by a reporter for the BBC where I commented on the restrictions in the kingdom in the mid 2010s. And yeah, I think that that's going to come back to haunt me. But so what happened in chapter three, sorry, section three, and my fiction writing friend really helped me with this, is that we ended up addressing East and West, past and present, through just simultaneity, if you will. Everything merges into one. The dialectic isn't there as much. So I have to say, if you ever want to write a memoir in poems, it's absolutely possible. I don't know if I recommend it, but you could do it.
Mhm. Thank you, Majda. Um, Paul, The Last Supper follows from your previous works about Bach, and about the Catholic novelists Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, Thomas Burton, Dorothy Day. Could you talk about how this book came to be, and the artists that you talk about?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. And meanwhile, I'm parking all sorts of thoughts that I have based on what Majda just said, because I think um, I found the structure of her book really natural, and which isn't to take away from artistry. I'm not to say it was didn't take doing, but the way in which it moves uh, um, it was very attractive, and um, worked in several directions chronologically in terms of different cultures, and in terms of central intelligence at different levels of maturity, uh, both in the poems and retrospectively. And it feels alive and has a wholeness that we associate with a kind of whole person. So whatever you did, it really worked well for this reader. So thank you. But back to your question. So it was about 20 years ago, I wrote a book about four American Catholic writers, and Flannery O'Connor, Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, and Walker Percy. And they were the writers who had made me understand what it meant to be a Catholic, because I'm a literary person. I guess my to have a literary point of access to Catholicism was what helped me understand the tradition in which I'd been raised. And then it was also a great story of precursors. These were the people from the age of that had the old Latin Mass, confession every Friday's Catholic Church on the one side, and the Second Vatican Council in the center of their lives, and the Catholicism of suburbs and papal masses and football stadiums on the other side. So they helped me understand where I'd come from culturally. And I went out. I did a lot of events in connection with the book, and the question that kept coming up was who are the Catholic writers today? Who are their successors? There are certain successors, but at a certain point, I came to think, well, the question is kind of misplaced. They don't have direct successors so much as the situation changed. Those writers were right at the center of the Catholic faith in the sense that they were relatively orthodox, but they were on the margins of American culture. And I realized that my own experience in the 80s had been of artists, musicians, writers who were more at the center of popular culture and on the margins or at the edges of the life of faith. Leonard Cohen, U2, Prince, Patti Smith, and others. So how the situation changed and how those people articulated what I call a crypto-religious outlook that made religion credible and attractive to me at a very difficult moment in the 80s became the situation that I had to figure out. And the way I figure things out is through long and complicated narratives. So that's what I wound up doing.
I love what you said about literature sort of giving you that understanding of the context in which you grew up. And these artists seem to be artists who met the moment, right? And sort of gave you that milieu to really frame that prism through which you can look at your own life, and for many of us as well. Um, Paul, I'm glad you mentioned crypto-religious. It's a term that really is at the center of your book. Could you talk about the definition of what crypto-religious is? And I know you cited Czeslaw Milosz as someone who used that as well. So could you talk about how that definition was contextualized for both Milosz and yourself?
Yes, and it was so significant to hear Milosz come into Majda's poem a few minutes ago, that this author that we have in common. Milosz figures into the life you say, maybe your own, my first book. He wound up in a dialogue with Thomas Merton, who wrote him a kind of fan letter, and they met a mutual need. Literary people with a religious disposition who felt misunderstood, and their letters are remarkable. So in the pandemic, I was kind of stuck on the book that we're now discussing. And I wound up going back to my own earlier work. And there, in the exchange of letters between Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, and Milos, the Lithuanian poet who had broken away from the regime and was living in Paris, was his definition of himself as crypto-religious. And that became the key that I needed for the later work, for this book about the 80s. What do I mean by it? Crypto-religious work is work that makes conspicuous use of religious imagery and language and figures of speech and motifs, but from a position other than that of conventional belief. So that when you encounter this work, Gloria by U2, or I Would Die for You by Prince, or 100 different versions of Last Supper imagery by Andy Warhol, or The Last Temptation of Christ by Martin Scorsese, or Hallelujah by Leonard Cohen, you ask yourself, what does the person who made this believe? Are they being ironic? Are they being serious? Is it just part of the fund of imagery that artists in the West draw on? Are they flipping the bird at the church? What's going on here? And that act of trying to figure out what the artist believes, what the valence of religion is in the work, leads you to think, well, what do I believe? What's my relationship to this whole tradition? And so the way in which we're implicated in the work makes it crypto-religious for us as well as for them.
It reminds me of a line in your book when I believe it was Toni Morrison eulogizing James Baldwin, and she says of him, his is a life that resists summation but invokes contemplation. And paraphrasing that, but right, the crypto religiosity sort of inspiring contemplation on behalf of people who are wondering what they believe in. Thank you for that.
When she said that, she was in the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, where Baldwin was being celebrated. 3,000 people were there. And he had characterized himself as an ex-minister of the gospel, to the point where, so this is in the 80s, the age of the televangelists. And also, Carter had been president and evangelical, and Baldwin had stepped up and written pieces for places like The Nation, identifying himself through his Christian upbringing. And that's an aspect of Baldwin that is often overlooked, but really significant one.
Right. Paul, I'm glad you read that portion of your book because that is what I wanted to center on. And I'll just read an excerpt of your excerpt in that, quote, devotion is a religious impulse in its purest form. It's a strong feeling for something outside of oneself. It longs for the loss of self, yearns for surrender to some other. And we can unpack more of that. But I did want to ask you and Majda to discuss your relationship to devotion and ritual, broadly defined, of course. Majda, we can start with you. For example, your poems are punctuated by ritual, often religious in nature, right? There's passages where you're fasting as a child with your father, listening to the muezzin. There's prayer, chanting Quran. Can you talk about how ritual gave shape to your memories as you wrote these poems, and talk about what shape your rituals take for you today?
That's a lovely question. Yeah. I I've noticed in America that people really have zero context for Islam or Muslims. Um, don't really know the difference between Arabic and Farsi, Sunni and Shiite. So I had to walk this line in the book about, being specific, but not providing too much context. I don't even provide, you know, I mean, back when I started writing the book, I had so many footnotes in there, but they really distract on the page. So um, I just had to trust that the poem itself was going to contain everything I wanted to say. But um, I, so ritual in Islam, especially Sunni Islam, is really collective. So as you mentioned, it was more of a family experience, and that's the way that I wrote of myself as a little mimic when people would pray. Um, if I lived very briefly in Egypt during the year of the Islamic Revolution in Iran. We were moving back from the United States to Saudi Arabia. My father had been the um, the Saudi liaison to the USGS in Northern Virginia, the U.S. Geological Survey. His contract was up, and we were moving back to the Middle East, to Saudi Arabia in 1979. The revolution was happening. The Holy Mosque had been actually taken over by hostages, and we were moving to a city near the city of Mecca, Jeddah, my hometown. So we ended up in Egypt, where my father had been raised, actually a British boarding school with Omar Sharif. And um, I just was starting to learn to be a little Arab girl who was also a Muslim, because not all Arabs are Muslim, actually. In Egypt itself, so many ancient faiths converge there, and that's really beautiful to see. But of course, I start to learn through the family rituals of getting together and watching people pray and hearing the adhan. And in Cairo, the adhan is not synchronized like it is in some other Middle Eastern cities. Like in Dubai, for example, they all occur at the same time, just boom, boom, boom. The adhan is coming from several minarets. In Cairo, it's well, I was in Alex, but Cairo is the Victorious city, but so I remember Cairo very well. So it was adhan, 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 muezzin, muezzin competing. So, these things create a fabric, and I won't linger on that too long. So I love the communal and cultural aspects of Islam, but once I had to enter into the Saudi school system, it was pure orthodoxy, and I left that behind. I went into an iconoclastic phase. That's where I found punk rock, and it was my church. I sold my soul to rock and roll, for rock and roll, to misquote AC/DC. And over time, the more that I was migrating back and forth, I just found my own rituals, and people refer to themselves now as being culturally Muslim. And that's what I say, is that I have this culture that is faith, a faith as well. But am I practicing? No. Uh, did I grow up in a family that was devout? Also, not really. But when you're Saudi, it is a devout country. In that way, it's very like Iran. So it was a confusing scenario, I have to say. But yeah, I don't know. I hope that I held it all in place in the book. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for answering. And it sets the stage for devotion as it applies to punk rock, which we will definitely talk about in a bit. Paul, what about you? How can you speak on how ritual gave shape to your own upbringing and who you are today?
Yes, and so I was raised Catholic. My father had gone to Catholic seminary. His uncle was a Catholic bishop. One of his sisters was in the convent for about 10 years. So Catholicism was all around. But the rituals of Catholicism had been dramatically altered around 1965 through the Second Vatican Council. The Mass was in English in the United States. The churches were brightly lit instead of dark. The music was more casual. Uh, Instead of confession in a confessional booth, they had folding chairs in the parish hall, and you would sit side by side with the priest. And I didn't necessarily like it or dislike it, but I could feel the disjuncture, let's say, between Catholicism as it was depicted in the movies and as it was figured into older books and what I had experienced. So as I mentioned earlier, I was trying to figure out how these two very different presentations of Catholicism fit together. The one of my suburban childhood and the one that you found in, um, uh, 19th century French novel or whatever. The four writers of my first book helped to explain that. But it also helped me to understand that, and I didn't put it this way at the time, I was just a teenager. I'm traditional in that I think that religion is a natural expression of the human spirit. We're not just projecting our stuff. Uh, it, it's like sports or sex or language. It's a natural part of the human disposition. Uh, so um, the drama then in my own life, but let's focus on my book because it's easier to discuss. In the 1980s, when I was coming of age, was there were all sorts of people who had the natural disposition for religion and for religious ritual and devotion and other aspects of religion, but they didn't kind of know where to put it because uh, either the church had changed drastically, or in that moment, the Catholic Church, led by John Paul II, had taken a kind of very hostile position on so many aspects of contemporary life in the United States, to which the answer was just no. All sexual matters, no, 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 no. The United States was supposedly a culture of death that was opposed to the putative culture of life. I felt pretty alive in New York City in 1983, So how do I make sense of this? And I think what I did was recognize my kin or my tribe, these crypto religious artists who were doing their thing, who were kind of working out the very problem that I was having, or the challenge, which is where does the religious disposition go when when institutional religion kind of doesn't quite fit? And so, although I didn't understand it as well at the time as I did when I wrote the story of that, a third of a century later, that's what I try to dramatize in The Last Supper.
It seems, there's so much resonance with faith, again, loosely defined, vis-a-vis power, right? And how certain individuals sort of inspired so many people of what faith could look like when it resonated so much with people to, you know, speak against power or embody what that resistance looks like. Um, I would love to talk about that a little more, but I want to also focus on this aspect of sacred and profane, right? Both, in the Catholic context, the Muslim context, and, however any of us in the audience have grown up with that duality, sacred and profane. Um, Majda, why don't we begin with you? What kind of, how does art proceed from that collision of sacred, profane, permissible, haram? How did your imagination, flourish in that intersection?
That's such a wonderful question. I was an art history major, so I became really fluent very quickly in Catholic symbols and imagery and lore and just the culture around art. And it was not the same for art, visual art in Islamic countries, specifically in Saudi Arabia. You won't, when I was growing up, you would not have seen the human figure depicted at all. So I grew up around a lot of calligraphy and carpets. And although in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, my hometown, we have a lot of public art. It's all kind of abstract. So I the one Saudi artist I encountered who really was pushing boundaries was in the mid 2000s, a woman, and she escaped to Australia so that she could make her art. And she did the poster for the Woman to Drive movement, hashtag Woman to Drive movement, that ended up imprisoning several activists who were driving in the mid 2000s, mid 2010s, and that I own some of that, like personally. Like I went out of my way to find her in Australia and buy like a test print of some of that work, which is street art, right? And that's deeply personal to me. I don't tell many people that I own that art, and where political art like that doesn't really happen. I will say that there is great art coming out of the Gulf states. When I was in Saudi Arabia last year, there was a beautiful exhibit on new Islamic art, and people are finally able to sort of engage with the sacred texts um, in really unique ways. There was this sculpture that was just rotating black oil. And as it rotated, it continued to just move like hypnotically. It was just pure black and it was huge. It was as big as a wall. And it was just such an interesting commentary. So it seems that there's artists in Saudi Arabia are finally being able to comment, but they're sticking aesthetically to these acceptable lines of Islamic aesthetics. So, but for those who are in exile or self-exile, you know, they're finding a way to, well, before Khashoggi, they found a way to sort of make noise. But it's a really fluid situation, I have to be honest with you.
Mm. Fluid, dangerous, obviously, but I appreciate you pointing out, the presence of art there, um, which many in the West, don't aren't exposed to or don't notice. Paul, back to you about the same question with the sacred and profane. What comes to mind is um, Sinead O'Connor, who you mentioned in your book, and many of us remember her tearing Picture of the Pope on Saturday Night Live, which, she was exiled, right, culturally after that. And her redemption didn't really come till much later in her life. Um, what separates that crypto-religious art when it collides with what is profane? What I guess what I'm trying to say, what is crypto-religious art in that case versus just shock for shock's sake, which many people labeled, that act as simply being shock for shock's sake.
Right. There's several dimensions to this, and I'm thinking about what Majda's just said. Her whole comment. Part of the story that's told in the Last Supper is how the terms of engagement changed in the course of the 80s and early 90s. Uh, what was going on in the United States, and I'm generalizing broadly, was that uh, the United States was ceasing to become a Christian country in the way that it had been demographically. There was a lot of immigration from the Middle East, from South Asia, that had begun in the 1960s, but the people who had migrated were making themselves felt culturally. It takes some time. So uh, Christian leaders were feeling this, the loss of a kind of exclusivity to Christianity and a kind of protected role for Christianity that was upheld by the courts and the newspapers and mass media and so forth. And so that shift made it, in your terms, a fluid situation. And that's the story of the book. People were trying to work their things out in this new space. So when Martin Scorsese made The Last Temptation of Christ about Jesus being fully human as well as fully divine, which meant dreaming of having a family with Mary Magdalene and children and sex. Uh, the Christian leaders uh, raised a ruckus about this supposed conspiracy of Jewish Hollywood against Christianity and making Scorsese their tool. That culminated in August 1988. A month later, in England, the Satanic Verses was published, and there was a controversy beginning in England and then stoked when the Ayatollah Khomeini issued a fatwa in February '89 against the Satanic Verses for its representation of Allah in the book. And that's a super complicated episode. But the irony is that after that, the next episode involved right-wing Christian voices in the United States uh, going after individual artists. They basically realized, why did we take on Hollywood? That's too much. If we could just gang up on an individual artist, it's much easier. Andre Serrano, he's a very little known artist who suddenly becomes vilified by members of Congress and the entire religious right. Robert Mapplethorpe, likewise, and he's also dead. He's pretty easy to gang up on. So the right wing, the Christian, supposedly Christian voices, borrowed from the playbook of the Ayatollah Khomeini and how to strike out against artists, pick on the individual. And Khomeini also introduced violence. So by the time we get to Sinead O'Connor, that mode of cultural attack has been what do you say, like road tested, right? So Sinead O'Connor tears up a photo of the Pope on live television. It's cryptic. What does it mean? And that's a whole other story. I mean, the sexual abuse crisis was just coming into view. ABC had done a full hour about it. The breakthrough book, Lead Us Not into Temptation by Jason Berry, was published within 10 days of that Saturday Night Live episode in October of '92. It was finally coming to the surface, and Sinead O'Connor evidently was kind of gesturing towards that when she tore up a photo of the Pope. But the pile-on was so immediate and so aggressive. Most people learned about the whole episode from some right-wing columnist in the newspaper rather than from seeing it on TV. The controversy preceded the event for most people. So you had a situation, and I'll end here, where the supposed guardians of culture were saying, we're horrified by this thing that we're going to drive this person from public life for an act that is so horrible that you can't even see it and we can't even tell you about it. It's unspeakable. And that dynamic ode to this Last Temptation of Christ, the Satanic Verses, the controversies over Mapplethorpe and Serrano, and Sinead had to kind of bear the full load of all that had gone before.
Yeah, you mentioned political tactics, and we were just seeing variations of the same theme even today, right? Different context, but um, which leads me to my next question about, for artists who sort of pride themselves on resistance, whether it's, irreligious or crypto-religious or religious with a capital R, um, compared to that, punk rock has its own niche in priding themselves in that sort of anarchy, right? Majda, if I can segue into this topic by quoting your poem, you write, "Who will love the sidewalk? Menagerie outside CBGBs like I could have." Time was television, sang Marquee Moon, and the whole world fell into place. Um, Maja, could you begin by talking about the special devotion? And Paul, you mentioned that punk rock is a specific form of a pure devotion. Uh, Maja, could you talk about the devotion and belonging that punk rock inspires for you, and what constitutes that same, devotion that you see in today's environment?
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I have to just respond to what Paul was just talking about, though, because the chapter about Sinead ripping up the picture of the Pope, I stayed up to watch that. I was listening to Sinead O'Connor's The Lion and the Cobra, and I was completely immersed in her worlds. She was like some kind of emissary or vessel of something that was that spoke to me, though I didn't really understand a lot of her imagery. But you mentioned in the book that she had been reading Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and in my family, in the late 80s, that was a huge book, believe it or not. Somebody smuggled it into Saudi Arabia and we were passing it around. Oh, I didn't raise my hand. Okay, never mind. But can you just mention to people a little bit because like Dan Brown ripped off Holy Blood, Holy Grail 100% when he wrote the Da Vinci Code. This is like a little, I don't think people know about that book anymore, but it apparently was sitting in Sinead so much that it was troubling her. Is that right?
So this is a book, and I probably know it less well than you do, but uh, there was a bookstore in Spring Street in Manhattan called the New York Open Center. And the Open Center had um, various classes and day activities involving what was called New Age religion. Sometimes different rituals, a lot of them coming out of California or out of South Asia. But they had a bookstore, and it was a kind of um, clearinghouse of alternative religion texts. The stuff that you wouldn't get on the nightly news, or you would get from the Catholic Church or whatever. And Holy Blood, Holy Grail is one of those. It um, spoke to the power of the Catholic Church as a kind of conspiracy involving secrets and rituals that were meant to initiate people into keeping the secret, as I understand it, uh, in sinister ways. And it's a long book and highly rhetorical. And what's often forgotten is that Sinead O'Connor was born in 1966. So in 1992, she's 26. She's been a musician since her teens. Like Bono and like a lot of others, they're largely self-educated. So she kind of has to find her, she's grown up in public. And so the books that she reads make a really strong impression on her because there's not a Jesuit priest or Harvard educated professor like in my university education to kind of tell you how things fit into the big picture. So she was overpowered by this book, I think, and that affected what she did at that time. Does that speak to what you were saying, Maja?
Yeah, I just had no idea about that impacting her at all. I mean, I just learned so much about some of my favorite bands, like honestly, U2 and I think that because they were so young as well, when I was a teen in the 80s, that they accessed my imagination directly that way. So it's just really fascinating research. I took up a lot of time, but when did I convert to punk rock? Probably the first time I heard The Clash sing Rock the Casbah on a smuggled videotape of recorded MTV in the Kingdom. Sometimes we would just end up with random media. If somebody had a video, a Betamax that they'd recorded overseas and they got it through um, security at the airport, you would watch something random, but yeah, it was hearing Rock the Casbah, and I used to spend a lot of time in London in the 80s, and I would see punks, and so I was always very curious about what that was about. It seemed like a tribe that I wanted to be a part of. So, and that's another part of my life, but DC subcultures were really, really interesting. We had Bad Brains and Minor Threat, and it just, as soon as I landed back here and finished high school, I just went right into DC and just experienced it. So,
And that speaks to something that Michael brought up that, if you don't mind my jumping in, Michael,
Mhm.
the so I was on the punk scene in Albany, but we were watching DC carefully. And I would say that um, DC dramatized one element of the punk experience more than other cities, and it was the DIY aspect of it. That punk was saying, like, you can do this yourself. You don't need to learn to play like uh, Boston or Led Zeppelin. You can use your instruments and make your own sounds and consider it worthy, even if you're not up to the classic rock standard. And for me, that was really analogous to uh, what Flannery O'Connor called do-it-yourself religion. That's she felt that her characters were kind of working with do-it-yourself religion, and she was critical of that as an Orthodox Catholic. But I was, a generation and a half later, two generations, thinking that's kind of where we are. So the overlap, I, the do-it-yourself culture of punk was really attractive, and then I was able to recognize the extent to which the religious culture of the 80s was a kind of do-it-yourself religion as expressed by, let's say, Leonard Cohen, whose approach blends Judaism, the imagery of Christianity and Catholic Christianity especially, and Buddhism. And he's a kind of worldly man singing about um, moving in another person sexually. He's got it all going on in a way that belongs specifically to him. And that's what, to go back to Majda's book, the I'm very suspicious of the generalizations that were handed about religion, and we're facing a whole bunch of them right now. My own literary sensibility wants to focus on the way it works out in individual lives and in ways that elude generalization. And your book is a really distinct expression of that. No one except you has put it together the way you have, I think. And that's a source of its power.
thank you for saying that. I wasn't necessarily alone. I have a twin sister, but we had a little girl gang in DC of there were three of us, my twin and our best friend who we met in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War. And she was Yemeni, from a Yemeni Shiite family, but we were just sort of simultaneously drawn into the music subcultures of DC post the first Gulf War and wrestled through the guilt of being not great daughters and failing to really integrate into either world. When you choose to be a punk or a goth or go into the leather fetish scene, because these all overlapped, especially in DC. Um, and I used to actually DJ at dive bars and fetish nights, so I saw it all. And I remember very well when the Corcoran canceled their Maplethorpe show. I went to see the AIDS quilt. I mean, this reading Paul's book was like walking in, you know, my own past. And so it was so phenomenal for me, and I've just underlined it heavily. And it was, as Michael said, just a killer playlist kind of evolved. Just you could just listen the songs and hear so phenomenal. Anyway, I'm going to lose my track. I've lost my track, my train of thought. Sorry, Paul, take over.
Michael?
Um, Thank you both for that. And yes, such a great soundtrack from the both of you and your respective books. I do want to leave some time for Q&A, but I guess I just want to end on a question for the both of you. Talking about the crypto-religious, talking about punk rock, where do you see that sort of, you know, devotion from art that translates to resistance today?
Devotion and resistance. I don't see it much. I mean, if I'm honest, I wish but I'm trying to see it. Um, it might be hiding somewhere on the internet, and I'm finding poetry and the voices that are using poetry to be pretty iconoclastic. I have to give a shout out to Pussy Riot, who to me were as exciting as anything that was blasphemous or iconoclastic in the 80s and 90s. And I wish, I mean, you saw the response to them. And I think we've seen the response to the Arab Spring. So there's sort of like a counter revolution that's been occurring. And even in the United States, we're in the midst of that. The lack of funding for the NEA, that we're just not going to see. A lot of work is going to be suppressed, and it's deliberately being suppressed. But as I said, I was at an art space last night where people were free to express themselves, and there was this carcass of a smashed piano on the wall. It was very Dada, and there was a big sign that said "Free DC" and an excerpt of a Diane de Prima poem. So I felt really reassured and grounded that there's some sort of resistance happening in artistic spaces in DC.
That's great.
It's
Paul?
great to hear, and I know that the Washington Post is featuring an article now by their prize-winning art critic Philip Kennicott about resistance art in the Capitol right now, and it was very heartening for me to read that that's the case. A lot of what we call rebellion or resistance is basically just common sense in a time of nonsense. So the Clash, career opportunities. Mick Jones, he's offered a job opening letter bombs. What kind of job is that? For £5 an hour or whatever, he's going to risk getting blown up. And he's 20 years old when he comes up with a song, but he could just see how nutty that is, and he sings about it. So is that rebellion or is that just sanity, right? So through both Trump administrations, progressive Christians have been voices of sanity. I write about Catholicism, so we always tend to focus on these like leader figures, but I'm very aware of how the progressive Protestant Christians have been there and stood up in Minneapolis, in St. Louis, uh, in Portland, and to say no to crazy stuff. But right now we're seeing that the common sense that's being spoken by the Pope is being characterized as resistance. War is bad. It harms the weakest first. It's easy to start and hard to end. It is the major driver of migration. 1 million people in Lebanon having to leave their homes because of the warlike activities, the Israeli Defense Forces in that part of the country. I'm putting it the way I'm putting it to make it sound like just it's common sense to oppose wars like the one that Trump and Netanyahu are running right now. It has to be framed as resistance, but when Pope Leo speaks common sense, it's so significant that it's framed as an act of resistance. But so for me, punk was a kind of place of common sense, and the best religion was too. And I hope that it stays that way.
Yeah. Well, thank you both, in your craft, in the subjects you write about, you inspire belief, um, no matter who we are, religious, irreligious. Through your art, you sort of help us, kind of see that vision of transcendence, right? And how that equates to um, standing what we believe in. So I appreciate you both. Thank you for taking the time to be with us. I do want to save some time for questions. Feel free to drop it in the chat. We're small enough where you can even just chime in. So, Alyssa.
I have a question. I might articulate it awkwardly at first because I was j- I the term crypto religion is new to me because Paul, your book didn't come in time for me to read it. But it seems like it's a and it's really a question for both of you, and it's about music because I don't have a background in art history. But it seems like it's a concept that can map onto when you're talking about music. It seems like you can map it onto it maps onto a lot of it's incredibly diverse because if you think about like Depeche Mode, they seem like kind of facetious and psychosexual, and then U2 like really starts and ends in a sincere kind of experience of faith, and then like Nick Cave's trajectory is like this wild like narrative arc that started out really kind of dirty and addicted and has landed very very differently. And so I'm thinking, I guess my question is kind of when you're thinking about this term and how and the 80s and how because I'm also of an age. I think Majda and I are probably pretty close to the same age. And I also was raised in a religious faith. I was raised in the Mormon church in rural Arizona. And I think that I'm wondering if what you're seeing in your research and what you're seeing in your experience, Majda, like if there was this, um, in this increasing secularism, are you also seeing a need for people to still feel connected to some expression uh, because you're talking about ritual and devotion. So sorry, it's all sort of bubbling up in my brain and it's still not totally articulated. But because it feels like two things are happening. The artists are needing to articulate it because they're also having the same experience, right? Of trying to make sense of this mess. And then there's the consumer of the art or the person who's needing that art to meet a need in them at the same time. And I guess I'm just wondering if there must be other time periods where this is also happening that and we're just talking about the 80s now. And also yeah, if because Paul, you were a Catholic person, and Majda, you were a person who had a lot of exposure to Islam, and so do you see that more in pockets of people who were leaving faith and
Right.
um,
This is really the mother of all questions. I mean, so I think if you're going to write a book, and especially a long book, you have to be audacious. I'm trying in my book to name something that doesn't have a name, to say there's a whole disposition that is out there in the world that people have that hasn't been identified. It's been articulated by all these artists, but let me try to give it a name so that people can recognize their experience in it. The crypto religious outlook or disposition, because we're usually used to thinking about religion as kind of on a spectrum from like true believer to total atheist, which isn't accurate to experience, I think. So let me try to introduce this other category that maybe some of us will recognize ourselves or understand the situation better. And so a whole narrative work, years in the making, is devoted to like, let me kind of give a name and a shape to this thing. And in doing so, I'm trying to do what I see the artists in the book doing. That when the Ramones came out, they were mocked as like this cartoon concept. These guys with fake names and leather jackets and 2-minute songs, but their combination of uh, male aggression, loud guitars, sincerity, fun, humor, and kind of throwbackness, it's been recognized all over the world now because they did it. So that's I'm trying to do something that others will recognize their own experience in.
There's a great Ramones museum in Berlin. Alyssa, did you see it when
Wow.
you went to
I
Berlin?
didn't get to see the Ramones
Oh,
Museum. No,
okay.
I did get to have a beer and a whiskey at the place where David Bowie used to hang out, though. That felt
Oh,
pretty good.
yeah, we could talk about David Bowie a lot too. I'm glad you brought up Nick Cave. We didn't talk much about him. He is in Paul's book, and he's also in mine. I
Yeah.
quote him in one of my poems. I really feel like he taught me how to write. But he has this arc where he's now in a redemption phase. But his first band, The Birthday Party, was just so profane. So I mean, there's one song is called what Big Jesus Trash Can. That was the first song I ever heard Nick Cave sing, and I was able to actually buy his CDs in Saudi Arabia, and it was the birthday party. It wasn't like the kinder, gentler Bad Seeds, which isn't really kind and gentle at all, but it is smarter. It is a lot smarter. They're not on as many drugs, maybe. But I'm most fascinated these days by PJ Harvey's arc. In the 90s, when her album Dry came out, I loved the Celtic mythology in there, the feminism, her song Sheila and a Gig, which is about this sort of really profane looking sculptures that appear of women holding their vulva, right? And these are tiles that you can find in churches across the UK, apparently. And I've never seen one, but those that gripped me. And now PJ is a poet. She's writing whole thick books of poetry in the dialogue of Dorset, the county that she lives in the UK. Now, how is this punk rock? But it kind of is. And she's touring on that, and I'm just so fascinated by the way people are continuing to um, to create self-mythology, because isn't that what I do that in my poetry? There's self-mythology in that. There's self-elegy. Maybe it's generational. Maybe it's just a trend in poetry. I don't know. But I love that the musicians that got me through the 90s and the 80s are still teaching me how to write, because they created my ear in English. Quran created my ear in Arabic, but it's Western music and punk rock that gave me, yeah, language and hopefully skill. I mean, or not. It's all DIY, as Paul said. DC also had a very, very heavy hand in the way I approach text. So
I love PJ Harvey. I've seen her live, I think four or five times. Saw the show at the Anthem in DC a couple of years
I was
ago.
there.
Yeah, that was a good show, wasn't it?
Yeah, I went up to actually I saw her in New York. I saw the Dry tour at the 930 Club, a very famous club in DC, when that album came out.
Which is
And
referenced in the book. Yeah,
yeah, so that was, yeah,
you saw her
just
at the Creation to see that. I didn't see her until the to bring you my love tour,
um
which was 3 years later, I think.
yeah, I
But
went
the
up to New
thing,
York to see White Chalk, and that was also like just very spectral and supernatural. It was amazing.
I was there at the Beacon and I met her
Yeah,
afterwards,
oh,
briefly. Well, I was working for a publisher, so you know, I knew she was writing poems. So I
You
introduced,
knew that she was writing poems?
yeah, I introduced myself, just gave her my business card, but she wound up being published by somebody else I know. uh, but for the purposes of this conversation, I think Nick Cave and PJ Harvey and the figures in my book, it's commitment that they have in common. They're, I don't know the birthday party too well, but Nick, it's a commitment is almost beyond sincerity, but they're PJ Harvey is totally committed to her vision of the world, and so is Nick Cave. So then when you mentioned Depeche Mode, I don't think we thought that Depeche Mode was committed to their view of the world. It was they were much more playful. But then when Johnny Cash does Personal Jesus, Johnny Cash is the walking, talking example of commitment in American roots music. So to take an ironic song and kind of reliteralize it through his commitment was what happened there, I think. And it's fascinating to watch. And I'm slicing it pretty fine, but kind of this is what I do.
Paul, you mentioned one of my favorite movies in your book. It's Mystery Train. Of course, it has Joe Strummer in it. I really feel like when I was failing to reintegrate back into American life, that movie helped me sort of realize that there was just misfits like me that can come to understand the big mythos that is America, because it's what is America but this mythology that's unfolding, you know? So,
And at that moment, more than now, so U2 and Bruce Springsteen and The Clash and Tom Waits in their different ways were all trying to reconnect to the like pre-television America, let's say, black and white, kind of pork pie hats and unfiltered cigarettes and uh, heavy steel cars. And that it's very hard for us to see now, but that post-war America represented a kind of like purity and richness that was the antithesis of MTV and Reagan and uh, televangelism. Now it's just all kind of caricatured as Heartland America, but it had a very powerful allure at that moment for those of us who grew up in the United States, not just in Saudi Arabia. That just it felt like that's where the real action was.
oh, good. I'm glad that I saw that at the right time when it came out then, because yeah, I needed to see that movie.
I think we may have time for one more question if anyone has one.
Michael, is there time for the question that's in the chat from Laura Rosenthal from earlier?
Yeah.
Laura, I saw that you were maybe walking, so I can read it aloud for you. It's from Majda. It sounds like you were living in Saudi Arabia when
Oh,
you
you
wrote.
know, and I could clarify that too. I'm sorry, I am out walking and I was
Okay.
trying to avoid having my video on. But I would say because the conversation has progressed so much that maybe there's a way of refining the question. I think I'm really interested because I was interested factually in whether you were in Saudi Arabia when you were, publishing the book, writing and publishing the book. But also, and this has kind of evolved since the conversation started, it sounds like in many ways, even living in DC now, you're balancing still between how much to say, how much to, I know my words are going to be wrong, but how much to hold back or protect perhaps. And knowing that my words are doing violence to the experience you were describing, if you could talk about how you're mediating perhaps between the two cultures and how that impacts what you still feel you can be publicly candid about, regardless of where you are geographically, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And I mean, thank you for asking that. That's a really compassionate question. my entire life, Saudi has gone through these phases where, I mean, it's mostly just been an Orthodox upbringing. So now we're in this new frontier, um, that's post Khashoggi, as they say here in the West. And I have noticed because pre-Khashoggi, we were getting some dialogue and pushback, and there isn't really like a public sphere for art, not just in Saudi Arabia, but in the Gulf states. And the past 26 years, I wasn't just going back and forth to Saudi. I actually self-exiled for a little bit after I lost my father because I wanted to protest the guardianship laws there. I have to have a male sign me out of the country even though I'm an American citizen, and that still happens. I have male guardians, but now they've made it electronic, so it's like an app on my phone. So that's still kind of humiliating. So I actually have been going in and out of the Dubai. My family moved there 26 years ago to attempt to raise my younger sister in a more secular Islamic country. But there's just no social sphere for art and expression in any of those places. Nonetheless, I did write a lot of poems in both countries. One poem in my chapbook I wrote when I was back in Saudi Arabia for my father's funeral services. He's buried in Virginia in a Muslim cemetery, but we did go back to the kingdom for his Azza for 3 days of mourning and where we wear white, which is not a color I like to wear at all. And yeah, it's really profound for me to write there. And unfortunately, it's just always going to be a balancing act because it's just, as I said, fluid. It's just going to depend. And there's all this tracking software now. Um, it's dangerous. It's really, really dangerous. And so in Paul's book, not that I'm comparing myself to Miłosz, but he had to self-exile and he didn't feel that he would ever be really free in Eastern Europe. I just really relate very much to that. And there was a book, I'll wrap this up, but there was a book that came out very recently of new writing and translation of poets from Saudi Arabia. And I did not know any of them. And that is something that I really want to explore, but it's about the desert seen through the lens of the 21st century and digital media. So it's really an interesting concept, but again, it's conceptual. That's not necessarily the kind of poetry that I write. So I remain an Arab Anglophone poet, writing in the West for the rest of my life, I suppose.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, just all of the insight and things that, I think you can tell from my question and others just are, it's almost like we lack a full context to even ask the right questions, but I so appreciate what you're bringing to us and the additional insight.
Thank you for letting me talk about it. It's very much a hidden world. Um, we have little networks, Saudis in the West who are. There are other women there. I'm not alone. My friend Iman Gota is a Saudi American fiction writer. She won the Arab American Book Award for her book Bride of the Sea, and she contextualizes a lot of what our families went through. Our fathers migrated to America for college on a scholarship, and then had to go back and work in the kingdom for their careers, and came back with American wives. But so her book Bride of the Sea is a great work of fiction that talks to Saudis migrating to the United States, Ohio specifically, and the story unfolds from there. I really recommend that just because there's so little of that in English. So thanks for letting me talk about that.
Well, thank you, Majda. Thank you, Paul, for this conversation. Wish we could head to the bar and continue it, but appreciate you taking the time. And thanks everyone for your questions.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you, Majda, and let's stay in touch.
Please, definitely, anyone email me. Paul, I'm going to be in New York in the summer. See Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Okay, let's be in touch. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much.
Thank you, Michael. Wonderful
Mhm.
questions.
Thanks.
Definitely, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you.
Majda and Paul, excellent conversation.
Cheers.